You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
The other reason that a lot of this does not survive is just sort of the accidental havocs of history, which is everything from being lost in the sense that they're destroyed by fire. Two of the artists that I talk about in this book, in a very weird twist of fate, proving that history is always stranger than fiction. Most of their surviving collected works not only go up in flames, but go up in flames because they've been relocated to the same museum together. This is something that happens to a lot of these works.
Hello, and welcome to episode 423 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Have you ever noticed how discussions of the American Revolution often focus on grand battles, founding documents, or famous statesmen? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to look at the American Revolution through the eyes and hands of an everyday person? Today, we're going to do just that. We're going to explore the life and work of Prince Demah, an enslaved man who became a professionally trained portrait painter, gained his freedom, and fought for the revolutionary cause. Our guide for this exploration is Zara Annis Hanslin, an associate professor of history and art history at the University of Delaware, and the director of its Museum Studies and Public Engagement program. Zara is the author of The Painter's Fire, a forgotten history of the artists who championed the American Revolution, a book that investigates the lives of artists like Prince Demah, Phyllis Wheatley, Patience Wright, and Robert Edge Pine, artists who were everyday people. Now, during our exploration, Zara reveals how Prince Demah and his mother Daphny forged a path from enslavement to artistic recognition, the surprising role London played as a hub of revolutionary artwork, and how artwork produced about the revolution during the revolution differs from the patriotic images we often see in museums today. But first, do you ever wish you could peek over a historian's shoulder and see how they really uncover the past? Inside the History Explorers Club, curiosity comes alive. Each month, you'll join live conversations with expert historians, some you've heard on Ben Franklin's World and others you won't find anywhere else. Together, we go beyond textbooks to explore everyday life, overlooked stories, and the detective work that brings this history to life. Membership reopens in January, so join the waitlist now at historyexplorers.club and get ready to be the first to step behind the scenes of history. Again, visit historyexplorers.club. All right, are you ready to explore the everyday life of an overlooked artist who lived during the American Revolution? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is a historian with a thing for things. She's an associate professor of history and art history and the director of the Museum Studies and Public Engagement program at the University of Delaware. Her research expertise is in the history of the 18th century Atlantic world and in the material culture or things of that period. She hosts a podcast, A Thing for Things, curates museum exhibits, and she's written 2 books, A Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, which you may recall from episode 84, and, most recently, The Painter's Fire, a forgotten history of the artists who championed the American Revolution. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Zara Annis Hanslin.
Thank you, Liz. I'm so beyond delighted to be here again.
Well, we're delighted to have you back, Zara. And I have to say, as a scholar of the American Revolution, I think about the American Revolution a lot. And I have never once given a thought to the artists who championed the cause. I think, like a lot of people, I imagine the works of John Trumbull or Charles Willson Peale or Benjamin West, who painted memorable images of the revolution and its people after the revolution took place. So, would you tell us how you became interested in looking at the artists who made artwork about the revolution during the actual revolution?
Yeah, it's a great question to start with, because I think that we sometimes think that the art is just there, right? We don't think about how it came about and why Trumbull's paintings are in the Capitol Rotunda, for example, and someone else's paintings are not. And the reason I got to thinking about looking at these sort of forgotten artists rather than the Trumbolls and the Copleys and the Peels and the Wests, who are also, by the way, in my book, but they're side characters. They're not the main event. The reason I got interested in looking at these lesser known artists is because I think in some ways they offer a different perspective on the art history as well as the history, in large part because of who they were. So they happen to be women, men of mixed race, enslaved and free. And also many of them operated during the American Revolution, not in the North American colonies, but in the heart of enemy territory, as it were, in London itself. And the idea for the book, it came to me because I was visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I was in the American wing where the famous Washington crossing the Delaware, the massive painting that everyone is familiar with, Trumbull's portrait of Washington and his enslaved valet, William Lee, all these great hits of American art history. And tucked away in the corner was a painting that I hadn't seen before because it had just come to the Met recently. This was in 2015. And it looked very folksy. It looked not as polished or heroic as a Trumbull, for example, but it was really intriguing and it visually caught my attention. And because I am a historian with a thing for things, the fact that next to it on display was the brooch that the man was wearing in the portrait, which had descended in the family for centuries alongside it, double caught my attention. And then when I read the label, I was just floored because it turned out that this was a signed work by America's first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in North America, a man called Prince Demah. And Prince Demah, as it turned out, was not just an enslaved portrait painter. He trained professionally in London with an award-winning British artist. And then during the Revolution, he enlisted to fight for the Patriot cause. And I thought, wow, this man's life sounds like a movie or maybe a really good book. And then I was off, and that's how it began. So really, I'm a historian who visits museums and then comes up with ideas.
Well, we're certainly going to dive into the story of Prince Demah because, as you said, it's just a fascinating story. But just to help us build a framework so we can better understand Prince Demah's story, would you tell us about the Transatlantic network of artists during the Revolutionary period, so roughly between 1765 and 1783? Normally, when we talk about transatlantic networks of the Revolution, we're talking about the philosophers, the philosophes, or the thinkers of the Enlightenment, and not artists.
Right. And I think one of the reasons that artists are so crucial to understanding revolutionary history is you could just think about political protests today. Regardless of what side of the political spectrum people are on, they use visual things to make political statements. Hats, posters, cartoons. And that was the case during the Revolutionary era as well. So artists are really critical to inspiring protest, to creating new political cultures that will foment rebellions, wage war, and then after the revolution is over, commemorate and heroicize the victors. So I really think to understand the politics of a war or a revolution, you also have to understand the art of it. And particularly during the American Revolution, because as you well know, and your listeners will too, I think, the colonial North American people did not live in a sort of isolated geographic world. They were very well connected to the entire globe, really, through trade, among other things. But in particular, they were connected to people around the Atlantic world. So the Atlantic world was really, I think we should think of it more as a bridge than a barrier between continents. So when you think about artists in the American Revolutionary era, they too are part of this transatlantic world that exchanges everything from ideas to commodities. Artists like merchants, for example, it's not unheard of for artists to go and train in London if they're American. Charles Wilson Peale, a bunch of gentlemen in Maryland raised money to send him over. John Singleton Copley ended up going over and staying because of the revolution. But one of the things that he was told was that he needed to get out of the colonies before his art was ruined. So that gives you a sense of some of the hierarchies in place here. But these artists that I'm talking about, these more forgotten artists, they're part of this larger transatlantic world that is populated by artists that are familiar to us today, like Copley and Peale and Trumbull.
Something that surprised me when I read The Painter's Fire is that a lot of the artists who painted images and created artwork about the Revolution during the Revolution did not actually live in the colonies turned United States. They experienced the Revolution in England, especially and particularly in London. And that's interesting to think about because when we think about art and classical artwork, we think about Italy or France or the Dutch masters. We don't tend to think about London as being a center or a hub for the art world. And yet it seems like London was a center for the art world during this period of the 18th century.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly for the British Empire, obviously. It was a place where artists as well as artisans, and I think it's important to recognize in the 18th century, there was a very thin line dividing the two types of practitioners. So artists were really craftspeople who worked in a different medium. So the epicenter of the London art community, for example, was St. Martin's Lane. And St. Martin's Lane was a very small geographic spread in London, but in it you could find condensed artists who were painters and sculptors and engravers and printers. But you also found people who made frames and sold books. It's where Thomas Chippendale, the famous cabinet maker, had his shops as well. So really, when you think about the art world in London in the 18th century, I think thinking of it in that more eclectic, broad category of people who are creating beautiful things to grace people's homes around the British Empire is one way to think about it. So again, it's really enmeshed with this larger pattern of trade as well as artistic production.
In The Painter's Fire, you note that most of the artwork that was created about the American Revolution during the Revolution was destroyed, so we don't have it anymore. Was it destroyed because a lot of it was produced in London, and we imagine London to be a very anti-American place at this time? Or were there other reasons that this artwork just didn't survive the test of time?
One of the things I discovered in my research is that surprisingly, there's always a considerable amount of support for the Americans in England. It is never a universally popular war with the British people. Obviously, that changes after the Declaration of Independence, but particularly in 1775, you have a lot of important people who are more on the American side of things, which I found to be a fascinating part of this story. But in terms of the art, again, it's how we think of it, right? I think when we say the word art today, our brain tends to go to the paintings I was talking about at the beginning of this episode, the sort of gold framed, massive paintings that are in important museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But in fact, art in the time period, the way most people would have seen it was in a much more ephemeral, widely distributed, easily accessible format. So paintings, for example, if they were popular or if the artist was savvy enough in money-making ideas, would be copied into prints. And then prints, whether black and white or colored, could circulate around the British Empire. They were very accessibly priced. So that was one popular way that you didn't necessarily have to have access to the gold-framed portrait of King George III to see the image of King George III. And the other thing is that a lot of the political art that is created during the American Revolution, a lot of it in London, it tends to also be ephemeral because it's also created in this sort of print form. Things like political cartoons that are put in broadsides or printed as standalone things or put in side almanacs, for example. So these much more ephemeral forms of art are one of the ways in which images are popularly circulated during the Revolutionary era on both sides of the Atlantic. And then the other reason that a lot of this does not survive is just sort of the accidental havocs of history, which is everything from being lost in the sense that they're destroyed by fire. Two of the artists that I talk about in this book, in a very weird twist of fate, proving that history is always stranger than fiction. Most of their surviving collected works not only go up in flames, but go up in flames because they've been relocated to the same museum together. This is something that happens to a lot of these works. I open the book with a painting that is lost at sea in a shipwreck. So there are all sorts of ways that things can not survive the passage of time. I think it's really important for people to realize and remember that what they see in museums is only a very tiny part of the art that was once created and seen.
Well, let's dig into some of the fascinating artists that you discovered in your research. So in her book, The Painter's Fire, Zara traces the life and work of 4 Revolutionary-era artists: Prince Demah, Phyllis Wheatley, Patience Wright, and Robert Edge Pine. Zara, you open The Painter's Fire with the story of Prince Demah and his mother Daphny. Would you tell us about Prince and Daphny?
These are two of those historical characters who just grab your attention from across the centuries. And I think that, again, their lives are proof that history is just fascinating. And also, they remind me of the unquenchable human spirit that can drive people to make the most out of even the most horrible circumstances. And the first chapter is called Daphne's Son. And the reason I begin with that is because when I came across the portrait at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, they very understandably were emphasizing the enslaved status of Prince Demah, which is part of what makes his story so intriguing, because how does this man, against all odds, despite being enslaved, manage to make his way to London to train as a painter, which is hard for anyone in this time period, an artist who's just beginning, and then become a professional portrait painter, again, which is unusual for the period. But they very much framed this story as one of his enslavement and one in which it was his enslavers, Henry and Christian Barnes, who were a married couple in the mercantile business, who really were his art patrons. And this is undoubtedly part of the story, but really once I started reading the letters that survive from Henry Barnes and his wife, Christian, it became really obvious to me reading between the lines that Daphne and Prince very cleverly were the ones pushing this agenda to get him professional training and then have him set up as a practicing artist. And it was a really great reminder that enslaved people, despite the horrible injustice of the oppressive system in which they're enmeshed, are never just sitting back and not trying to control their own lives. And in this case, I wanted to honor the fact that Prince Demah and his mother Daphne were the ones who really planted the seed in the Barneses' minds about getting Prince trained. So that's why I started off with a story about Prince Demah as Daphne's son, not as the enslaved property of Henry and Christian Barnes. And I think just Prince Demah's name himself is a wonderful reminder of the sort of power of will that his mother Daphne had. Because Daphne was born in Africa, and then as a young girl, she was sold into slavery across the Atlantic. And she ended up spending the rest of her life in Massachusetts, but she never forgot that she was African. In the historical record, even when she was an old woman, to note that she was from Africa. And Demah is both a surname in West Africa and also a Muslim girl's name. And so it's unclear whether it was her surname in Africa or her own first name. But regardless, she made the very unusual decision to name her son Prince Demah. We know this because she was baptized alongside him. And so their names are in the historical record that way. And then, of course, when they were enslaved by the Barneses, they were known as Daphne Barnes and Prince Demah Barnes. When Prince Demah self-emancipated and enlisted to fight for the Patriots, he enlisted as Prince Demah. And when he wrote his will and left everything that he owned to his, quote, beloved mother, Daphne, he called her Daphne Demah. And so the power that they used this African name, the power that they attached themselves to their shared African cultural heritage, I think is a really great reminder that just the name alone tells you so much about Prince and his mother and what they did to really make the most out of their lives despite being enslaved.
Could you give us an example of the ways that Prince and Daphne were able to highlight Prince's artistic gifts and convince the Barneses that they should take him to London and get him professional training?
Well, Daphne, it's very obvious, is one of these people who's not shy, shall we say, to speak her own opinion. There are remarkably some letters that survive from her in the 1780s that she dictates to someone and has them sent to Christian Barnes, who at this point has been living in exile in the United Kingdom. And she's very sassy. She cracks jokes about common acquaintances they have, and she gossips, and she's very clever as well. It's obvious from the way Christian Barnes talks about Daphne that she was constantly telling her about her son and saying, you need to buy him back. He has this talent. Because Prince actually for years had been separated from his mother and had been working as a sailor. So it's unclear to me how he got the chance to show his artistic talent off. But, many sailors while the time away doing things like scrimshaw and other sort of artistic pursuits. And so I always wonder if that was part of where this came from, if, the time aboard ship gave him a chance to see other sailors engaged in artistic activities and to try it himself. But one way or another, they managed to get Prince's artwork in front of Christian Barnes, and she was wowed. And so she was like, you're right, Daphne, this guy's so talented. And so the Barneses purchased him. I think he was enslaved by her brother. Again, one of the things that I think it's important for listeners to know is that oftentimes the paper trail for enslaved people in the 18th century is very scant. It's sometimes really difficult to figure out how people were sold, where they were sold, when they were sold, if they were given away. etc., especially when it involves other family members. But it really is Daphne and Prince who get Christian's interest piqued and then show off his skills. And from there, Christian Barnes, she's a really fascinating figure as well. She's interesting and fascinating. She's also kind of horrible. So she's one of these very complicated figures from the past. One of the things that's fascinating about her is that she is someone who we could almost think of as a proto-feminist. She chafes under the restrictions of being sort of tied to domestic life. She wants something bigger for herself. One of the things that she does is help train young girls who are going to go into shopkeeping. And she writes to a friend at one point that she hopes that the young girls grow up and be huge successes and just run rings around the young men to prove that girls can do whatever boys can just as well. So I have to love that. It's like Abigail Adams' Remember the Ladies, but in a different format and from a loyalist woman. So there's that on the one hand. And then she really is invested in training Prince. And she admits to friends that she knows that this is going to seem strange and it's going to seem maybe a little bit ridiculous, but she really wants to do it. And so this is kind of extraordinary in and of itself. So the fact that this enslaved man and his mother get themselves in the position where he can show off his talents and then his enslaver decides to become his art patron is, again, just a story that's stranger than fiction in some ways.
How did being an art patron work? What argument did Christian make to convince her husband, Henry Barnes, that they should send their enslaved man Prince to London to train professionally as a portrait painter? And how were the Barneses able to find Prince an artist to train with, given that they're in Massachusetts and they want this training to take place with artists in London?
I think there are a lot of different things going on with art patrons in this time period. In the case of Christian Barnes, for example, I think part of it is she's kind of unfulfilled with her life. And so you get the sense that Prince is like a pet project for her. And it's something that is adding some interest to her otherwise humdrum existence at the time. Also, she seems really keen on art itself. So I think that she's just interested in furthering his talent. So I think that there are those motivations. I think the other motivation is with any art patron, and I think this is true of Christian Barnes, there's a reflected glory. So if you are the patron and your artist that you've sponsored does well, then you look great too. And you look like you're very savvy. And I think this is something that would have given her extra cachet in her community and in the broader Boston area in which they live. The other thing, of course, is there is always the practical side of things, that this is by no means a saturated market, the market for portraits in colonial North America. So a lot of people do this with enslaved laborers. They allow them to pursue side interests or side work, and they take a cut of the money. So it's another way to get more money out of your enslaved people's labor. So I think for Christian, it's really a combination of all of these things. And for Prince, it's really intriguing because this is where his career as a sailor comes in really handy. Because Christian says, again, writing to a friend, I know it seems crazy that I'm sending him to London, going through the trouble and the expense to have him trained. But Copley would not train him on account of his race. And so he had to go to London to get the training he needed. And Christian Barnes tells a friend, I'm going to make sure it's okay with Daphne, which is really interesting that she's going to ask permission from her enslaved houseworker. But she does. And she says, as long as Daphne's okay with it, Prince will work his way across the seas. Essentially, he pays for his own passage using his maritime skills. So it's really a perfect storm of Daphne and Prince maximizing their own position in the household and negotiating very carefully, I think, and skillfully and diplomatically a way to get him the training that he needs in London.
And how were the Barneses able to find Prince an artist to train with? Was it difficult for Prince to find a teacher, considering he was an enslaved Black man who had not yet sent his artwork across the Atlantic to be showcased in London, which is what John Singleton Copley did? And this type of training in particular, artists were looking for students who could add to their own legacies as artists. So who saw this kind of potential in Prince?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right about the reflected glory. It works with people training as well as the patrons. So in the case of Prince Demah, Christian Barnes did send ahead examples of his work to a friend who was living in London. And she shared her scheme and she said, could you shop this around and sort of gauge interest and see if anyone thinks he's promising? So again, it's unclear because there's not a clear, on day one, I went to this place and asked around. But I think what probably happened is that she started making some initial inquiries. She seems to have started with a man who made engravings of prints and who was in St. Martin's Lane, which, as I mentioned, is the sort of epicenter of the British art world. And in St. Martin's Lane, there would have been many different ways you could have gone about trying to find someone to train. There was the Society of Artists, which is a group of artists, the sort of precursor to the Royal Society of Art that is centered in St. Martin's Lane. There's St. Martin's Lane Academy, which trains artists. So there are lots of different places you could have gone to meet a lot of artists and show this piece of art off if you entrusted it to someone. So it's unclear to me whether this was set up before Henry Barnes and Prince Demah arrived in London or afterwards. But what they did find was someone to train him, and they found someone who was based in St. Martin's Lane, who was a member of the Society of Artists, an award-winning British painter who came from a family with multiple generations of successful artists, who also was probably of African descent. And although he told Henry Barnes that he would train Prince Demah on account of his genius, I think it was also because of their shared heritage. And it's interesting because Henry Barnes gave him a tip, but Robert Edgepine, who's the artist in question, did not charge to train Prince Demah. So this, I think, is an interesting statement about, again, this reflected glory that you would get from training this man who was seen as a genius. And in this case, I think being a Black genius is part of the appeal. So it's very much a double-edged sword, much like a woman genius during this time period. On the one hand, if you're an enslaved Black man and seen as a genius, that amplifies your genius because it is even more extraordinary. And there are certainly examples of similar people in terms of background being seen as geniuses in 18th century London, like Ignatius Sancho and Phillis Wheatley, who comes to London the year after Prince is there. So I think Prince is part of this cohort of Black geniuses who are seen as even more extraordinary, which is something that Americans also play off of. Ben Franklin is seen as extra extraordinary too, because he's a colonial genius. So I think that this gives even more cachet to you if you train one of these sort of outlier geniuses. On the other hand, it also means that it is more challenging to find someone willing to work with you, which is why it's so important to find a patron. And again, I think that the shared heritage might have played into Robert Edgepine's decision to do this. And we also know from his later political points of view, as well as some of his correspondence, that he's a very egalitarian-minded man. So I think that that probably had something to do with it as well.
I'd like for us to talk more about Robert Edgepine and what it was like to be a Black man or a mixed-race person living in London, because from your book, The Painter's Fire, it really seemed like living in London as a Black man or a mixed-race person was a whole lot different than living as a Black or mixed-race person in Boston. Plus, I also had this thought when reading The Painter's Fire that Prince is largely held up as an artistic genius, in part because he was a talented Black man. And the women artists that you feature in The Painter's Fire, Phillis Wheatley and Patience Wright, well, they were held up because they were women. And Phillis was a Black woman. So did Wheatley, Wright, and Demah ever get tired of being held up as non-white men, as members of their gender and racial categories, instead of just being the talented artists they were?
Yes, just call me a genius. Don't call me a Black genius or a female genius. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like we don't say a male artist, but we still tend to do this today. So it's an interesting, almost beyond historical question in some ways. So I think that Prince Demah and Phillis Wheatley and Patience Wright were each very good at marketing themselves, in the sense that they were very savvy about putting themselves in the right place at the right time, putting their art in front of the right people at the right time, at the right place. And I think that Phillis Wheatley for sure, and Patience Wright for sure, less certain about Prince Demah because he doesn't leave any correspondence. Besides, he leaves his will, but that doesn't tell us his innermost thoughts. But certainly Phillis Wheatley and Patience Wright used this to their advantage and were very careful to emphasize. Phillis Wheatley, for example, always emphasized her African roots and that she was enslaved. And Patience Wright always played up the fact that she was from colonial America and did things like said because she was American that she could call King George and Queen Charlotte George and Charlotte and get away with it, that type of thing. Whether that's true or not is up for debate, but she liked to say it was true. So again, these people they're really good at not just creating art, but creating a persona of the artist that goes along with it. And I suspect from how other people talked about him in correspondence that Prince Demah was equally skilled. There's a really intriguing line in one of Christian Barnes's, thank goodness she loved to write letters. So in one of her many letters, she's writing about politics. This is the early 1770s. She's writing about politics, and she's increasingly disgusted by the Liberty Men, as she calls them, or as we would come to call them, patriots. And she says that she's not sure what Prince Demah's political leanings are. She wants to believe that he's a Tory because he was born in their family, but she's not sure because he hasn't yet expressed himself. And I just thought, how fascinating on so many levels that here's this woman who is, first of all, deeply interested in what her enslaved worker thinks about politics. And then secondly, that he is diplomatic enough to keep it from her, because as facts later play out, he obviously is a patriot, not a Tory or a loyalist. So I suspect that he would have been equally good about using his persona to project his genius. And in fact, he did take out newspaper advertisements in Boston that he was available to paint portraits, and called himself a Black man whose genius had been assisted by one of the best masters in London. So he's emphasizing his own status as a Black man and an artist simultaneously, too.
So Prince Demah went to London to be trained in the early 1770s. What was Demah's life like in London, and what do we know about his teacher, Robert Edge Pine?
So he wasn't in London very long, and one of those sort of interesting what-if questions is that he left not long before the Somerset case occurred in 1772. Your listeners will know that this was a landmark case which essentially made it so that enslaved people could not legally be made to leave England if they wanted to stay. Which means that if you were a Phyllis Wheatley or a Prince Demah and you decided that you wanted to stay in England and live as a free person after Somerset, you could. And your enslavers could not legally take you out of the country in quite the same way that they could before. So it's always interesting to me to think about whether Prince Demah would have tried to stay in London if he'd been there after Somerset. On the other hand, Phyllis Wheatley was there after the Somerset case, and she returned with a promise of manumission, but she returned nevertheless. So it's hard to say. But while he was there, it was this moment of, obviously, as the Somerset case embodies, slavery is being debated in England, just as it is in the colonies. And it's being debated on moral as well as legal grounds. So if you are a Black person in London, you're swept up in this same general debate over slavery and freedom that's happening around the empire. But in London, you had some advantages that you did not have in colonial North America, because there were thousands of Black people living in London during the 18th century, and most of them were free. So this is a situation in which, in what became the United States of America, the situation is reversed in definitely every colony before the Revolution and most after. So I think that it's a very different experience if you are part of a free community versus an enslaved one. Although, of course, most Black people in London were laborers, were not among the elite. There were a few who reached celebrity status because of their genius or who had comfortable livings. And it just creates a very different network of possibility. It's also a place where racial intermarriage is not looked upon the same way it is in most places in colonial North America. Many Black people in London had white spouses. Ignatius Sancho, who I mentioned, he was married to a white woman, for example. And that's a very different social network than there is in colonial North America. There were Black people who were part of artistic communities as well. And so I think for Prince Demah, going from a place where, first of all, in Marlborough, Massachusetts, where the Barnes' household was centered, he was one of only 5 enslaved people in the entire community. And to go from being part of a tiny colonial enslaved minority to a bustling city that's the heart of the empire with thousands of Black people must have just been an amazing experience. And again, remembering that he's a sailor, I think is important to this story, because there are many Black sailors in the Atlantic at this point in time. So he would have had more than one network he could reach out into in London. He would have had the maritime network as well as the artistic. And then, of course, there's the fact of Robert Edge Pine. His father, John Pine, was most likely of African descent. And there are a lot of different reasons to think this. Primary among them is his portrait by his friend, William Hogarth. So I think for Prince Demah to go into this very different, vibrant atmosphere where race is much more fluid than it is. And the experience of being a Black person has many more diverse possibilities than it does in colonial Massachusetts. Would have been just an amazing experience. And then to be in the household where he was recognized as a genius and where he would have been trained as an artistic equal and someone with great potential, I think had to have been an amazing experience. And so I think even though it wasn't the largest chunk of his life, I think it was probably one of the most pivotal. And I think it's one of the reasons that he mentions it in the newspaper advertisements he takes out. It's good marketing, but I think it also left an indelible impression on him.
Yeah, as I read The Painter's Fire, I also wondered what Prince must have felt about all the possibility around him. I mean, he was an enslaved person, so there wasn't a lot of possibility in his life before he went to London. But then all of a sudden, Prince finds himself in a place where he could see an artist who looked like him succeeding in the world. And Robert Edge Pine, he was a very well-known historical painter at the time, so Prince is studying with someone who's rather famous. So it really just must have been interesting, if not disheartening for Prince, to see what his life might be like if he had been free and living outside of British North America.
Yeah, absolutely. And Robert Edge Pine had trained other painters before Prince Demah, of course, and some of them are themselves famous in their own right. So John Hamilton Mortimer is maybe the most famous. So he's part of a lineage of exciting painters who've been trained by this man. So again, I think it would have been just a very intoxicating experience in the best possible way.
You mentioned that Demah didn't train with Pine for very long before he went back to Boston, where the Barnes allowed him to hang up his own shingle, so to speak, as a portrait painter. Could you tell us what we know about Demah's return to Boston and his work as a painter in Boston? Did the fact that he was a Black painter deter anyone from seeking his services for their portraits?
Yeah, some great questions. So I think that the timing of his return was based on Henry Barnes's business needs. So like many merchants, Henry Barnes went to England regularly to make connections, buy and sell things. And they also had a lot of family connections there. So I think that the return trip was dictated by Henry Barnes's schedule more than anything else. But as you say, when Prince Demah came back, he was allowed to set up painting portraits. And unfortunately, there aren't the records that tell us how many portraits he painted. I strongly suspect there are still some Prince Demah paintings in attics in New England and on walls in New England. In fact, I saw one the other day that I think is one. So I don't know. I need to do some more sleuthing. But we do know from records that exist that he was hired, for example, by a well-off Boston merchant called, I'm going to butcher his name, Malafia. I want to say Mehitabel, but that's not right. We'll call him M. Bourne. And he painted his son for him. So there's an account record for that. But I think that Bourne, for example, might have had some abolitionist leaning or at least been friendly towards helping to give enslaved people better lives because he also paid for 2 boys that were enslaved in the Bourne household to receive an education. And so that, I think, is a really interesting intersection of perhaps abolitionist tendencies or at least wanting to help these enslaved boys get an education, if not outright lead to abolition, with being willing to hire a Black portrait painter. But we also know the painting that's in the Met was painted in 1773, and it was a Scottish-born merchant, William Duguid, who clearly hired Prince Demah to paint him. And Prince Demah's signature is on the back, although it would be cool in any circumstance. But what makes it especially cool is that at the time, of course, he's still enslaved by the Barneses. And so it's signed Prince Demah Barnes, but the Prince and the Demah are really large and the Barnes is tiny. And we know that as soon as he was able to self-emancipate, he did drop that last name Barnes like a hot potato. But the point is that William Duguid not only hired him to do this painting, but was quite content to have his name on the back of it. And his descendants kept it there over the centuries and loved it so much, I think, that it's one of the reasons they saved the brooch that he wore in the portrait alongside it. So even though I can't answer your question about quantity, I can tell you that qualitatively speaking, he got some good commissions from solid citizens. He wasn't sort of out in the streets doing caricatures for a couple pennies. He was getting bona fide commissions that were being made by people of standing.
Now, before we travel back across the Atlantic to talk about Robert Edge Pine, we should take a moment to thank our episode sponsors and to talk about Demah's life in revolutionary Boston. Have you ever wondered what life was like in early America beyond the dates and battles? At Ben Franklin's World, we dig into the details that textbooks skip. The voices of women, indigenous peoples, enslaved people, immigrants, and ordinary men and women who shape their world and ours. Each week, you hear from leading historians who bring new research and trustworthy insight so you can explore the past with confidence, not confusion. But this independent work, it only happens because of listeners like you. Listeners like David J., Miriam K., Kristen K., Philip R., and Kathleen S. You make these conversations possible. You help keep our show independent and our episodes free for everyone to enjoy and learn from. Thank you for your generosity, and thank you for supporting this work. Ben Franklin's World is produced by Clio Digital Media, a small nonprofit supported entirely by our community. People like you who believe that history should be accurate, inclusive, and alive. Every gift, whether it's $5 or $100, helps us keep these conversations free and accessible to everyone who wants to understand where we've come from and why it matters today. And because Clio Digital Media is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, your gift is fully tax deductible. So if you value this kind of important everyday history, please visit benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Thank you so much for helping to keep history honest, human, and accessible for all. Thank you for being a part of our listener community. Zara, could we talk about Prince Demah's life in Boston and what that was like? He returned from London in the early 1770s, so he's missed the Boston Massacre, but he was living in Boston during its occupation by British soldiers and when Lexington and Concord took place. And his enslavers, the Barneses, they were living in central Mass. So Demah was basically on his own in Boston, and we wonder what that was like for Demah, to be this enslaved man, but working and living on his own, away from his enslavers, and having taken different political views from his enslavers, as Demah was a revolutionary and the Barneses were avowed loyalists.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, I think, to think about this one household of a white family and the Black family they enslaved as a microcosm for the divided loyalties of the American Revolution and how complex it was in terms of dividing not just the colonies, but neighborhoods and families. And what you see with the Barneses, it's a number of different things that I think point to much broader facts about the American Revolution. The first is that they are very loud loyalists in a patriot area. And Henry Barnes, I will say again, things to admire as well as things to find less admirable about him. But one of the things that I admire about him is that he wasn't a hypocrite. He refused to sign the non-importation agreements. He refused to boycott British trade because he thought it was fine for Parliament to impose the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties. And he was a Tory. He was a loyalist to the crown. And he refused to side with the Patriots. And because of this, he was constantly called out very publicly. He was often one of about 5 merchants who were called out in town meetings in Boston. Their names were splashed on newspapers, broadsides. And I think that because of this, the Barneses became a target. And so they were a real lightning rod for anti-loyalist vitriol and violence during the American Revolutionary era. And one of the things that happened that I think is most remarkable is that Henry Barnes operated a pearl ash works. It was attacked one night. A wagon full of his goods was attacked the same night. And the driver was sort of beaten up and they stole the contents, which a lot of it was pepper, which was a very valuable commodity at the time. And then they hung an effigy, a sort of dummy in sight of the Barnes' house in Marlborough, clearly labeled it as a stand-in for Henry Barnes. And then they burned the effigy at night, which would have been a terrifying thing to see, this effigy identified as you go up in flames. And later that same night, and this is the only example of this ever happening in the Revolutionary era that is recorded, some of their neighbors in Marlborough who were patriots stole a horse from its stable and tarred and feathered the horse, its saddle and bridle, which if you think about a horse and its hair and tarring and feathering, that must have just been awful. And an awful spectacle to see and smell and hear. And they set an effigy on its back, which again was associated with the Barneses and had a piece of paper that said that they wished the Barneses all in hell. So if this is happening in your small town and you probably know the people who are doing it because they are local men, this would have been really terrifying. So the Barneses, after all this happened, and then other horrible things happen to them, like Christian Barnes is held up at gunpoint in her own house when it's just she and Daphne are there. It's this terrifying experience for them, so much so that they actually leave early. They leave in 1775. They see the writing on the wall and they're done. And so what is interesting is that Prince Demah and Daphne are sort of, again, the record is very murky, but they don't go with them. And so they're sort of self-emancipated. They also, though, lose their home because the Marlborough House gets commandeered by the Patriots and given over to the use of General Henry Knox and his wife, Lucy, which is very upsetting to Christian Barnes because she's known Lucy Knox her whole life. And she says, Lucy should know better than to be using my piano and my furniture and my paintings. So Prince Demah and his mother are freed, but they are sort of adrift. What do you do at that point? And so I don't actually know where they end up in 1775, which is an interesting question. So I wonder if Daphne went to Boston as well, because we know Prince Demah was operating out of a watchmaker's shop on King Street, not far from the site of the Boston Massacre. And this watchmaker was called John McLean. And we know that John McLean was a patriot. So they stay behind when their loyalists and slavers leave, and they're certainly connected to patriot networks. So whether they went with fellow patriots out of Boston during the siege or stuck it out and sort of kept their head down is unclear to me. But I think it's a really good reminder that in some ways, the fact that we don't know is a great reminder of how complex and full of turmoil that time period is, and how hard it is to trace these people's steps if you don't have the letters that they write talking about what they've done every step of the way.
In The Painter's Fire, you made a point of showing us how Phillis Wheatley injected her politics into her poetry, and how Patience Wright, who was this very well-known wax artist, went about making busts of American and British revolutionaries. You also noted that we don't know that much about how Demah would have incorporated his politics into his artwork, but that we do know he championed the cause of the revolutionaries. Would you tell us how Prince Demah championed the revolution, if not through his artwork?
Another interesting plot twist in his story is, as you say, we don't know what his art, because his art that survives is pre-Declaration of Independence that we know of. So it would have been an interesting comment maybe on boycotts or something, but nothing USA specific. But one thing we do know for sure is that he did enlist to fight for the Patriot cause. And he enlisted with a Massachusetts artillery unit that was nicknamed the Train. And the Train was a sort of famous artillery unit. Among other things, its commanding officer, Colonel Thomas Crafts, was the one who read the Declaration of Independence out loud on King Street when it was read out loud in Boston for the first time. Its second in command was a guy your listeners would have heard of, Paul Revere. And the officers were, like Prince Demah, all artisans. And this gets back to my earlier point about there being a sort of very thin divide between artists and artisans in the time period. And limners or portrait painters would have been seen as very much akin in terms of social and economic status to someone like Paul Revere, who was a silversmith and a printmaker. So I think that Prince Demah had a lot in common with the officers of the Train. Colonel Thomas Crafts, when he wasn't officering, was a Japanner, so someone who made wooden furniture look like it was Asian lacquer furniture with decorative paint techniques. So this is something that it's interesting to me to consider whether this was a happy coincidence of Prince's artisanal connections intersecting with his political beliefs that led him to military service in the Train rather than, say, the Continental Army.
When we talk about artists of the American Revolution, we think of Americans who went to England to be trained. Someone like John Singleton Copley, who was a loyalist, but he went to England not just to escape the revolution, but be trained as an artist. Men like John Trumbull or Benjamin West or Charles Wilson Peale. We don't tend to think about English artists like Robert Edge Pine, who really did support the American Revolution. So would you tell us about Pine and where he got his American revolutionary views, and then how he infused those pro-revolution views into his artwork?
Yeah, and I think you're so right that, again, it's sort of like we don't think about people in Britain being against the American War, as they called it, as we call the American Revolution. I think that Robert Edge Pine is a great example of there was this, never the majority by any means, but there was a small, passionate group of Britons who were pro the American Revolution. they were pro the American Revolution for very idealistic reasons, usually. So they thought that it was spreading the ideal of liberty around the globe, and that the principles that were enshrined in the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence were the principles that should be upheld and were actually walking in the footsteps of the best of British constitutional law, right? That the Americans were actually holding the torch of British liberties up higher than Britain itself. So it's not surprising that there are artists in this group, because artists tend to be passionate and creative and open to new thoughts and ideas. And we know from his letters that Robert Edge Pine was very Republican, little r, and very egalitarian leaning. We know from voting records, for example, that even though he's listed as a gentleman, so he has some economic status, that he's the only person in his immediate neighborhood voting for the radical Whig politician in a 1760s London election. So his politics are very much in line with the people who became American patriots, because he's painting people like John Wilkes, who's a great darling of the Paul Reveres and the Sons of Liberty. You know, they see John Wilkes' constitutional rights being trampled on just like their own. And Robert Edge Pine actually painted one of the most popular portraits of John Wilkes. It gets made into prints, so it circulates around the British Empire. It even gets put on ceramic snuff boxes. So you could have looked at Robert Edge Pine's portrait of John Wilkes while you had some tobacco and thought about liberty. So Robert Edge Pine is one of these people who his art is certainly coinciding and colliding with his political ideals. And once the revolution kicks off into high gear, he becomes more attached to it rather than less. He really puts his reputation on the line. He creates this massive history painting called America, and it's an allegory which shows America bringing peace, prosperity, and plenty to the world. And Britain is definitely the tyrant trying to keep that from happening. And again, this becomes very popular because he gets it made into a print. And it circulates around the Atlantic world, including landing on the walls at Mount Vernon, because a friend of Robert Edge Pine's in Bath in England during the war was George Washington's BFF from Virginia, George William Fairfax. And George William Fairfax became friends with Robert Edge Pine, thought very highly of him, and wrote to George Washington that he was as true a friend to liberty as any man who'd ever lived, and that because he was so pro the American cause, his work had suffered in the UK, and that he really should be welcomed in America after the revolution. And it was Fairfax who helped finance the production of this painting America into prints. And it was Fairfax who sent the print to Mount Vernon, where it's still hanging today. So I think Robert Edge Pine is emblematic of this larger group of Britons and Americans living in Britain during the war who are pro the American cause, which again is not a story that's told very often, but he's not the only one. So he's not a complete outlier.
We often think of loyalists as paying a steep price for their loyalty, like the Barneses. Many loyalists lost their property, their friends and family, and their homes as they had to migrate away from British North America or even from their communities. And yet, when we look at Robert Edge Pine, he was also someone that seemed to pay a steep price for his loyalty to the United States. So would you tell us about the price that Pine paid for his loyalty and whether that was the driving decision that caused him to relocate to Philadelphia?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think something else that we don't talk about very often that's discussed in the book is that there is a Treason Act put in place that targets Americans and people who are actively supporting Americans in England, the Treason Act of 1777, that, among other things, completely does away with due process and the right to habeas corpus of people who are accused of treasonous activities against the king when they are conducted in the North American colonies or on the high seas. And so this is one reason that you have a lot of American sailors who are incarcerated in England for the duration of the war, because they're incarcerated at the king's pleasure. They don't even have to go to trial. So this is a very real threat that you can be imprisoned under the Treason Act. Henry Lawrence, the South Carolina politician, is captured on the high seas, on the Atlantic. And even though he tries to get rid of his incriminating papers, they're fished out of the water. He ends up incarcerated in the Tower of London for years. So this is something that's a very real threat. And there is a man called John the Painter, who was not a portrait painter, but more generic sign type things. But he had a plot to attack Royal Navy shipyards, and he saw himself as an American patriot, and even though he was British. And he actually was tried and hanged So it's harder to obviously get targeted for a piece of art than it is for trying to bomb the Royal Navy shipyards. It's a different type of political activity, obviously. But the fact remains that there's more than one way to threaten someone because of their politics at the time period. And economics were certainly one weapon. And Robert Edge Pine claimed at least that he lost patronage because of this. And so I think that his unusual decision to emigrate to the United States as soon as the war was done was motivated in part by knowing that in America, he would be, and he was, the most important artist by far who'd ever come to the American side of things and ever practiced in America. And that he would be welcomed with open arms as this award-winning British history painter, which is the highest level of painter that you can have, who was willing to paint Washington and Jefferson and Adams and really heroicize the great events of the American Revolutionary War. So I think it was to his economic advantage. I think he genuinely believed in the cause as well, in the ideals of liberty and equality.
You're right. It's really fascinating to think about people in England who supported the American Revolution and who ended up facing a similar kind of financial loss and then need to move away from Great Britain for their loyalties, just as loyalists experienced in their need to move away from North America.
Absolutely. It is fascinating. You're right.
Now, our conversation has focused on the life and work of Prince Demah and Robert Edge Pine, but as we mentioned earlier, The Painter's Fire also includes the stories of Patience Wright and Phyllis Wheatley. Sarah, taking a step back from all the research you conducted for The Painter's Fire, what do you think the lives and artistic work of these artists reveal about the American Revolution? How do you think artists can help change and add to our understanding of the American Revolution's people, places, events, and, of course, the politics?
I think one of the things that I hope readers take away from this is remembering that these people are extraordinary, but they're not unique. And so if you think about someone like Phyllis Wheatley or Prince Demah, that they are extraordinary, creative people maximizing their talents and doing great things against horrible odds. But I think they're a good reminder that we need to stop this narrative that they're outliers, that it's rare to have a Black talented artist, right? That it's rare to have an enslaved person who is creating the best life they can, regardless of situation. And similarly with Patience Wright, the reminder that Abigail Adams, for example, is not the only woman wanting a voice in politics at the time. She's not the only one who is a passionate patriot. That there are many women and many Black people who are actively working for the patriot cause and want to be part of the political developments and support the birth of the young United States just as much as the white men who tend to dominate our standard historical narratives. And that artists in general, I think, are really important to understanding the revolution, any revolution, because I like to say that philosophy is important, right? And obviously people get inspired by ideas, but people aren't usually out in the street waving their copy of John Locke around when they are at a protest. But they do use images. And I think that this is because images elicit emotion and they elicit a shared response, something that your listeners will all be familiar with. There's a reason that Paul Revere's Boston Massacre print is so famous to this day, because it is one of the best pieces of visual propaganda created during the war. Everyone knows at this point that the British soldiers did not line up firing squad style and fire into the crowd of unarmed men and boys. That's not how that went down. But Revere successfully made many people associate that visual with that event. And so I think that there's, in a way that is much more memorable and immediately recalled than pure narrative would have been. So I think that that's just the most famous example of what these artists were doing during the revolution that was so memorable and that got people really fired up and kept them fired up. And the title of the book, actually, The Painter's Fire, is taken from a Phyllis Wheatley poem in which she talks about the painter's and the poet's fire and about how the urge to create burns in every breast, just as the urge for liberty burns in breasts and people's hearts. I loved the reminder that creative people often keep that spark lit that is required to get lots of people motivated to do the same thing at the same time, which is what you need to have a successful revolution.
We should move into our segment 1776 in context. Now, in The Painter's Fire, you state that the artwork that we have that teaches us about the American Revolution portrays the movement and the war in comfortable ways. And that this is all well and good, you note, but this is not the artwork that was produced during the actual American Revolution. So, Zara, now that we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, would you tell us how the paintings of Benjamin West, John Trumbull, Charles Willson Peale, and others portray the Revolution, and what their paintings don't show us about the American Revolution?
Yeah, so I think that those paintings do a great job doing what they were meant to do, which is build a mythology, a heroic mythology around the memory of the American Revolution. That's what they aim to do. So nice job, fellas. They succeeded, I would say, very well. But I think if we take one of John Trumbull's most famous paintings, which again, I think most people will immediately be able to call up in their mind's eye, which is Congress declaring independence. So the iconic, enormous portrait showing the Big Five clustered around the moment where Thomas Jefferson is presented the final document. And then you have the room full of the members of Continental Congress, all of whom are white men, of course. And every single one of them has a well-turned calf. They're all wearing really nice suits, not a drop of glistening sweat or anything, despite the fact that it's midsummer in Philadelphia. And if you know, you know. And there's an elaborate rug on the floor, and there are huge velvet draped curtains swagged over the windows, and the ceiling is really high, and the chairs are upholstered armchairs. That is a complete falsification of what it actually looked like at the time. And what's an interesting contrast is one of the few of Robert Edge Pine's big history paintings of the Revolution that he was working on that did not go up in flames is called Congress Voting Independence. It shows the exact same scene, but the men have not been photoshopped. There are some paunchy bellies here and there. There's some not so well-turned calves. There's no rug on the floor. The men are all sitting in Windsor, unupholstered wooden chairs. There are blinds on the windows, no curtains, and the ceiling is dropped by about 12 feet. And what it is a very faithful replication of the inside of what we now call Independence Hall and the actual furniture that was there. And the actual way that the men looked, warts and all. There's not really any sweat in the picture, so still not that. But in other words, it is a non-photoshopped version. I think what Robert Edge Pine was trying to do, very much working in the moment, right? He's in America 1783, 84, so right after the wars ended. And he's trying to paint this heroicizing, yes, but also realistic depiction of what's happening. And Patience Wright, the wax sculptor who we've just mentioned a few times, she very unfortunately, to my mind, died before she could carry this out. But she wanted to have a gallery of life-sized wax figures of all the important founders in Independence Hall. And she wanted to go back home to America to do it. And just imagine if instead of looking at the marble statues of George Washington, we had a life-size wax figure. That would be amazing. And so I really think that the work of people like Trumbull and Copley and West, it's fabulous. And I'm not knocking them. They're wonderful. But it very much does create this very heroicized view. And we can compare it with Robert Edge Pine's remaining painting just to see how drastic the difference would have been between this man working at the moment and then these men working in some cases after the fact. So Trumbull, for example, paints this later. But Trumbull, it's obvious if you look at the two paintings side by side, Trumbull looked at Robert Edge Pine's painting as a model. So it's really intriguing, I think, to think about the changes as well as the losses in the art.
Well, Zara, you've written 2 books and you have a new podcast, A Thing for Things. Do you have time for another book project or museum exhibit?
Yes. Well, I do have the thing for things. So there's always something that I'm fascinated by. As you mentioned, I do have a podcast that I'm a co-host on. It's called Thing for Things. It's a history podcast, as we call it, the show about stuff that's not stuffy, the history podcast where things happen and stuff matters. Each episode, we take a single object or object type and talk about its larger historical meaning, often in conversation with other historians, art historians, contemporary living artists, and curators. So we try to bring the past into the present. And season 1, The Stuff of Revolution, is the first half is already launched, and the second half will launch later this fall. So give it a listen anywhere you like your podcast. Season 2, I think, will come out next year and be The Stuff of Magic, partly to honor the 400th anniversary of Salem, Massachusetts being founded. So a very different topic, but fun things, pun intended, in store. And in terms of my own research, my next project is, I've just decided I'm a one-trick pony, and I'm a historian who goes into a museum and gets inspired by a portrait and writes a book. So there you have it. I guess this is what I'm going to do until I stop writing entirely. So my next book is inspired by two portraits hanging in the Whaling Museum in Nantucket. Lord help me, I'm going into the 19th century a bit, which is not my usual territory. So that will be interesting. But it's a story about the interconnected lives of a Black family and a white family who both live on Nantucket and whose lives collide in really interesting ways as Nantucketers resist self-emancipated people being snatched back to Virginia by a slave catcher who makes the foolish mistake of coming to the island to try to take them away. It's a really inspiring story about what communities can do together to uphold each other's safety and freedom when they're threatened by people who would take those away.
Now, if we have more questions about the different artists in the Painter's Fire or about the things of the 18th century, where should we get in contact with you?
I have a website, drzara.org, so you don't need to remember my last name or how to spell it. I also am at the University of Delaware and have an equally easy email address there, zma@udel.edu, and I'm always happy to be in conversation with people.
Zara Annis-Hanselin, thank you for joining us again and for showing us the Painter's Fire and how artwork can tell us a whole lot about the past and the American Revolution.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Liz. It's always such a pleasure getting to talk history with you.
Prince Demah's story reminds us that the American Revolution wasn't just fought on the battlefields or debated in congressional halls. It was an event that was lived in everyday homes, workshops, and even on transatlantic voyages. The revolution was shaped by people whose names we rarely see in textbooks, but whose lives were no less extraordinary. As Zara has shown us, Prince Demah's art and the artistic path that he and his mother Daphny carved out for him challenges us to expand our definition of who counts in the history of the American Revolution. Prince and Daphny were not just passive figures who feature in someone else's story. They were agents of their own making. They were creative, strategic, and committed to both freedom and its expression. As Zara reminds us, the art and artifacts that we see in museums represents just a tiny fraction of the art and things that once existed. Much of the art created during the American Revolution, especially the art created by marginalized and everyday artists, has been lost to time, fire, and shipwrecks, and has therefore been lost to our historical canon. But thanks to historians like Zara Annis-Hanselin and to institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who are willing to elevate these hidden histories, we're just beginning to see a more complete and inclusive portrait of the past. Look for more information about Zara, her book, The Painter's Fire, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/423. Be sure you tell your friends about today's episode and Ben Franklin's World. After all, friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, do you have a favorite piece of Revolutionary era artwork? I'd love to know what it is, so please tell me about it. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com.